result of the global impact of the Haymarket Affair, May the 1st was adopted as International Workers' Day. In the years that followed, demonstrations led by anarchists were held everywhere. But it was notably in France that the Chicago Massacre heralded a new era of anarchism, one characterized by bombs and propaganda by the deed.
Propaganda by the deed, with no specific perpetrator, is a spontaneous expression of revolutionary action.
It doesn't have to be an explosion or a bomb, just an action that goes beyond words. The anarchists believed that heroic action was the best way to get the libertarian message across.
So
this challenged the revolutionaries. It wasn't enough to be a revolutionary who talked but left the action to others. Revolutionaries had to act and demonstrate their credibility through their deeds.
A man named Francois Königstein, otherwise known as Ravachol, was very taken with the idea that action could create the revolutionary spark that would inflame the West. He followed to the letter the words of Louis Michel and Kropotkin, who along with Malatesta were the new theoreticians of anarchism, calling for unrelenting revolt through speech, writings, dagger, or dynamite. In Nobel's new invention, Ravachol also saw the ideal way to destroy the old world. He set about learning how to handle nitroglycerin, and gripped by rage following the brutal repression of the very first May Day demonstrations in France, he decided to act.
The anarchists decided to make May 1st, 1891 a day of conflict and action, not a day of orderly parades, as it has now become. As a result, brawls broke out in Clichy, where policemen punched the anarchists, and the anarchists punched them back. Then in Fourmi in the north, police opened fire at women and children leading the procession, causing several fatalities. This prompted Ravachol to plant some bombs.
Symbolically, Ravachol placed his homemade bombs in suitcases on Boulevard Saint-Germain and Rue de Clichy, outside the apartments of the judge and the Advocate General who had condemned 3 anarchist demonstrators to long prison sentences. The damage was impressive.
They didn't kill any people, the bombings. They were seen as retribution for the overzealous prosecution of some anarchist demonstrators in Clichy. So basically the French police, and also to some extent the British police, and the media in France and in Britain saw Ravachol, who was really not an especially significant figure, as being the face of anarchism, the dark face of this destructive creed.
The myth of the anarchist bomb planter had been born. Ravachol frightened people. He was hunted down. The police acquired new weapons, while its officers reinvented themselves as scientists. One of the first anthropometric records in history was produced. His picture was distributed to newspapers, and his name was headline news all over the world.
The Fourmi newspapers had a circulation of between 700,000 and 1 million copies a day. And through their headlines, particularly in the Sunday supplement, they did their utmost to stir up a climate of fear. But generally speaking, the attacks did not, initially at least, outrage public opinion.
In fact, Ravachol became something of a hero in the eyes of the public, in the style of highwaymen like Mandarin or Cartouche. He was seen as an avenger, for whom a song was written to the tune of La Carmagnole.
There was a price to be paid for being a dyed-in-the-wool anarchist. Unlike terrorists, who make their attacks then flee, anarchists had to confront society openly and justify their acts in court. They had to use their trial as a megaphone, ensuring that the anarchist message resonated everywhere, loud and clear.
Faithful to the strategy of propaganda by the deed, when Ravachol was arrested only 3 days after his last bomb exploded, he assumed responsibility. At his trial, addressing the court of Seine, where he knew his life was at stake, he justified his actions.
Currently, too many citizens suffer while others swim in opulence. This situation cannot last. Today, the anarchists are numerous enough to overthrow the current state of things. All that is needed for that is a shove, and the revolution will take place.
Ravachol was condemned to prison for life with hard labor. But after a second trial for a common law case, he was sentenced to death. And so it was that one cold morning in Montbrison, his cry of 3 cheers for revolution was cut short by the guillotine's blade. His execution, far from scaring off other libertarians, acted as a call to arms. The anarchist press demanded vengeance. A veritable explosion of activity ensued. Everybody wanted to be involved, urged on by publications that soon became known as the Dynamite Press. With their scientific exposés of anti-bourgeois armory, bombs began to go off everywhere. The restaurant where Ravachol was arrested was blown up. Auguste Desvallions, the French Guy Fawkes, attacked the National Assembly. Léon Léautier wielded a hacking knife. Amédée Pauwels blew himself up at the Église de la Madeleine. The bombs of Émile Henry claimed several lives, one of which went off in the restaurant of the Saint-Lazare railway station. Also dynamited were Rue de Faubourg Saint-Jacques, Rue Saint-Martin, Rue de Vaugirard. It was a similar story in Angers, Le Havre, Boulogne-sur-Mer, Marseille, and especially Lyon, where the violence peaked following the assassination of French President Sadi Carnot by a 20-year-old anarchist, a young baker from Italy.
When President Sadi Carnot visited Lyon, Sante Geronimo Caserio seized the opportunity to murder him. Carnot had been warned by both police and anarchists that the blood of those who had been guillotined was on his hands, and Carnot was stabbed in Lyon.
The death of Sadi Carnot was like a thunderbolt. He was given a state funeral and his ashes placed in the Panthéon. His murderer was quickly tried and sentenced to death. To ensure that his final resting place did not become a shrine, the remains of Sante Geronimo Caserio, anarchist and martyr, were tossed into an anonymous grave. But it was not enough, and the repressive measures increased.
During this period, France adopted what became known as the Loi Scélérate, the villainous laws, which banned all anarchist and anti-militaristic propaganda, regarding it as a criminal conspiracy. This made criminals of all activists, including any poor souls who happened to subscribe to a libertarian magazine.
This was staggering. These dangerous anarchists turned out to be a watchmaker from Saint-Imier, for example, who had sometimes yelled out incendiary slogans, but who hasn't ever shouted, "Hang them all" or "Death to the police." Everyone's done it.
The world was thrown into a panic. The craziest rumors abounded in ministries and consulates. The anarchists were plotting. They were a grave threat to the security of nations. Following the United States' lead, governments drew up laws against the Black Peril.
The idea of a terrorist conspiracy, an international terrorist conspiracy, emerged. It was actually the first time the phrase war on terror was used. In around 1894, the New York Times talked about how European governments were planning to exterminate terrorism. This kind of language was used, you know, and sometimes it was quite melodramatic.
To fight this imagined international terror, a very real international police force was set up. The governments of 21 countries organized an international conference for the social defense against anarchists, which laid the foundations of what would later become Interpol.
In Rome in 1898, the world's governments gathered for the Anti-Anarchists Conference because every leader, king and prince, was terrified of being assassinated by an anarchist. But it was all to no avail because on July 29, 1900, in Italy, King Umberto I was slaughtered by an anarchist, Gaetano Bresci.
He wasn't the only one. Despite the repression and emergency measures, monarchs and state leaders were falling like flies under attacks from the anarchists. The Russian Tsar, the presidents of Uruguay, Ecuador, and El Salvador, the Spanish chairman of the Conservative Party, and the Portuguese king and crown prince were all killed. Meanwhile, in Geneva, Luigi Lucchini stabbed Empress Elizabeth of Austria, better known as Sisi. In Madrid, the Spanish head of government was assassinated. And so on, right up to the war, when Alexandros Skinas murdered the King of Greece, and Gavrilo Princip, the Archduke of Austria, and his wife. But faced with anarchist propaganda by the deed, the state fought back with propaganda. And for smart businessmen, anarchism could be used as a promotional tool, as was the case with Thomas Edison, who used the execution of Leon Czolgosz's murderer of US President William McKinley to promote his two new inventions, the 35mm cinema and the electric chair.
It was not that great in terms of casualties and in terms of the level of victims. I mean, some historians have said that probably no more than 100, not much more than 100, maybe less than 200 people were actually killed in the various episodes of anarchist bombings.
For anarchists, by the end of the 19th century, one thing was certain. The strategy of assassination had shown its tactical limitations. Nowhere had it triggered insurrection, and the wave of killing had lost the libertarian cause a great deal of credibility. For theoreticians, it was time to get back to basics.
By the end of the 19th century, many anarchists, including anarchists who had once accepted the necessity for propaganda of the deed, were beginning to reject it. They were beginning to talk in anarchist journals that this strategy was not only not leading anywhere, it was actually counterproductive.
Enrico Malatesta, famous Italian anarchist, said the problem is we have isolated ourselves from the popular struggles, and the place we should always be is with the people and their struggles. So in the 1890s, after a relatively brief period, you had a movement of the anarchists back into the popular struggles and organizations, back into the workers' movement, and then you had the development of revolutionary syndicalism.